Was what happened on January 6th an insurrection? And within your answer, can you define what an insurrection is? Glenn, can you start, and then we'll go to Destiny?
Yeah, I'm really glad that we started there, because I do feel like we spent in that last debate a lot of time on the question of whether this was a coup or whether this was an insurrection. And I feel like these are more political terms of art than terms of science that have a concrete definition, which is one of the reasons why I think it's not only justifiable but actually necessary to look at how these terms have been applied historically and in other contexts, not as a way of distracting from January 6th, but precisely to see whether or not the attempt to apply those terms to January 6th is consistent with how these terms are generally used, or whether it's just kind of a partisan attempt to create a narrative that serves the Democratic Party. So for me, I guess you kind of have to look at coup and insurrection a little bit differently. A coup is when some faction in society, either the faction that is already in power or the faction that is not in power but wants to be in power, mount some very credible and serious attempt, almost always using force or the threat of force, people who are a militia or the actual military, in order to seize power illegitimately outside of the legal structure, using violence or the threat of violence in order to do so. An insurrection just simply, I think, implies that there's a faction domestically that has launched a serious rebellion, a serious attempt to seize power in that country, again, using extrajudicial, extra-legal means that, in almost all cases, involves either the use of force or the threat of force. You may be able to imagine a situation where the use of force or the threat of force is not necessary for an insurrection, but I think it's extremely difficult to imagine such a case. But in general, that's how the terms are used. And then you have these kind of subsidiary terms that are very new, that are kind of retreats from those terms, like legislative coup or soft coup, that, as I said, is a way to kind of put it into the general category of coup and insurrection without actually calling it one. And that typically involves the illegitimate use of a legal process or some other means that's still extrajudicial, contrary to the law, without actually using force or the threat of force to achieve those ends.
Destiny, what's your thoughts?
Yeah, I think I'm happy to almost run with Glenn's definition here, because I think January 6th pretty squarely and easily falls within that. But I guess the two definitions I would offer up are the Colorado Supreme Court. They concluded that an insurrection, as used in Section 3, is 1, a public use of force or a threat of force, 2, by a group of people, and 3, in order to hinder or prevent the execution of the Constitution of the United States. In Paulson and Baud's paper, they go over broader definitions, but they more or less say the same thing in more words. We can read from them, and they would say that insurrection is best understood as concerted, forcible resistance to the authority of government to execute the laws in at least some significant respect. So I would say that like an insurrection is probably more than being upset at a police officer and saying like, no, I'm not going to, get a ticket and running away. Probably has to involve a group of people who are making a concerted effort to like resist the good faith execution of law from the federal government in this case. And I think January 6th with Trump's plan to circumvent the electoral process with false electors, the actual day of events where Trump gives a huge speech. He sends a whole bunch of people down to the Capitol, ostensibly to protest the certification of the vote, where the people at the Capitol engage in violence in order to prevent Congress from certifying the vote. And then when the people at the Capitol engaged in violence succeeded in preventing the certification of the vote for some number of hours, and then were finally cleared away, I would say that whatever we call an insurrection or whatever definition we use, all of the events here are bullseye like an insurrection.